Good morning, everybody, and happy Friday. Welcome back to your lunch break with me. My name's Ivana. If you are new here, if you're not new, thank you so much for coming back. Today, we're going to talk about something that is near and dear to many of our hearts, and that is college football. If you have been paying attention to the college football arena or even just the news in the last 24 hours, you might have seen that yesterday on Thursday afternoon, the SEC announced a 10-game conference-only schedule. And in addition to that conference-only schedule, they also announced a delayed start date, and that is they won't start until September the 26th. So those were the two big things to come out of that announcement yesterday from the SEC. We have our own AL.com sports expert here, John Talty. He's going to break this down a little bit for us, tell us what this means for the teams, for the game, and for everything else. If you have any good questions for us, please let us know. I'll be monitoring them here. I will ask John as appropriate. So first, John, let's just talk about this decision and how this decision was made. Who made this decision? What input was taken into consideration before this announcement yesterday?
Yeah, so ultimately it's the SEC's 14 presidents and chancellors who make this decision. And so, on Wednesday, the athletic directors of all the schools met, and there was essentially a consensus. It wasn't unanimous, but there was a consensus around a conference-only schedule. And so that recommendation was then passed on to the presidents and chancellors, and they are the ones who have to kind of make that call, along with, of course, the guidance from the SEC Commissioner, Greg Sankey. And so there was a lot of debate around it. I think as you hit on, there were two kind of really critical, points that had to be discussed. One of them, of course, is what is the schedule going to be? And so, whether that was maintaining the same schedule, whether it was going to a conference-only schedule, which they ultimately did, or doing something similar to what the ACC did, which was having 10 conference games and then one non-conference game, and trying to kind of maintain some of the in-state rivalries with SEC schools like Kentucky, Louisville, and Florida State. The other key piece was figuring out when do we want to start the season. Anticipated to start first weekend of September, and ultimately they decided to push that back to September 26th, and also push back the SEC championship game to December 19th. And that's ultimately to kind of buy them some more time. It allows them to kind of continue to monitor what's happening. It allows them to get the students on campus, see kind of what they get from that. If there's a big outbreak or something like that, it just gives them some extra time to figure out, all of those key kind of junctures and kind of key data in order to try to play football in the fall.
So that start date, so the September 26th weekend, that's about 3 weeks or so later than what we're used to seeing football start. And I think that you bring up a good point, as in that gives these people, these decision makers, a little bit of time to see when people get back to campus, how those numbers look on campus, how things are going before they actually go and play. So there's a lot of questions here I know everybody has, and we'll get into those in just a second. But let me just first ask you, school is starting in a couple of weeks here. When are our players in our SEC schools going back to practice? Because this shift in starting date, I'm sure, is shifting practice date as well.
Yeah, so it's possible that it could. It's possible that it couldn't. So you already have the majority. I think pretty much all of the players are on campus right now going through voluntary workouts. They were scheduled to be able to start fall camp August 7th, and that was based on the start date. That date doesn't have to be pushed back. They are still able to start August 7th. But, now if the season being pushed back to September 26th, you might see some schools decide, hey, maybe we'll start a little bit later. Maybe we don't want to do fall camp for that long. Or maybe you start then and say, hey, if we have to shut down at any point, this gives us a couple extra weeks of window so that, typically if we had to shut down for a week or two, we're just going to lose that time. Now we've got these extra kind of weeks built into things that gives us more flexibility to if we have to quarantine a bunch of our team and things like that. So, I think we're still trying to figure out exactly. I think, this obviously announcement came yesterday. And I think coaches and different schools are kind of figuring out, all right, what's our exact plan? I don't know if all of them know definitively, but again, they have the option of starting on time as they maybe had previously anticipated doing if they would like to.
Now, have these players, have they already been on campus for a while now? Have they been, exposed to other people on campus, or have they been pretty much in their home bases before returning for camp?
Yeah, so a good chunk of them have been on campuses, and so they've been exposed to some extent, but they haven't been exposed to what they would see during a normal, college when everybody's on campus. And so they've essentially kind of been isolated amongst themselves. And so you've seen some different, positive cases. Alabama's had some, Auburn's had some, they brought all these different people together from all of their different places, you saw some early cases, Clemson had a lot early on. And that's really just kind of based on them being around each other, being around, some staffers. There were a few outbreaks in which college kids, went to bars and things like that. And that was kind of one of the big concerns. LSU had to, at one point quarantine more than 30 players because they went to some Baton Rouge bars and there was an outbreak. And so to this point, they've mostly been, it's not a bubble because you can't create a bubble in college, but they've had a kind of a little mini bubble in which they've primarily been around each other. But in the coming weeks, there will be a lot more kids on campus, and that's going to increase their odds of, bumping into different people and then potentially, contracting it from somebody outside of the football team.
What about testing? Do we know if the SEC is requiring that these players get tested before they play games against other teams? Because like you said, you can't create a bubble, but if you're always around your team, there might be security in there. But when you start playing after that September 26th date, you're going to be interacting with people from different schools, different states.
Yeah, so the SEC has been working with other Power 5 conferences and the NCAA to try to figure out guidelines and standardized testing protocols. I think the general expectation, you talk to different infectious disease experts and epidemiologists and things like that, is that you're going to have to test at least once a week. It could be, testing on Wednesday or Thursday before the game. And then, obviously you're going to need rapid testing capabilities in order to turn that around before, either traveling to a game or at the very minimum before that Saturday game. You don't want anybody going out in that field with a positive, case. And so you then might have to test again, after a game. Maybe that's that Monday or something like that coming out of, Alabama plays, Florida or something like that. You might want to test on Monday or Tuesday just to make sure that, they didn't pick something up from that game. And so it's going to take, at a minimum, at least one, I think, test per week. We've seen the NFL is planning on testing daily during its training camp. That's not what I think colleges will do, in part because of resources. It'd be extremely expensive for schools to have to do that. But I think, part of one of the reasons why the SEC wanted to go to conference only is that they can control their testing protocols. They don't have to worry about what other conferences or other schools are doing. They can set a uniform policy for all its 14 schools and make sure that everybody's kind of playing on the same rules.
We have so many people asking about this, and I think that, it's something that's obviously on a lot of people's minds, and that is opponents. Who's playing who? We know we've got a 10-game schedule, and we know that that's conference only. But what do those schedules look like? And what teams do we expect to face off? And what teams do we expect to not meet each other this year?
Yeah, so that's still being finalized at this point. The schools already have it. There are a couple of different models that are possible, and those schools already have a pretty good sense of who they're being played, but they're still it hasn't been approved yet. But essentially what's going to happen is that the SEC schools are going to keep the 8 opponents they already have on their schedule. They already had 8 conference games scheduled. You're going to add 2 conference games, and you're going to add 2 opponents from the opposite division. So there's not going to be any re-ups. They're going to maintain their divisions. So there's still going to be an SEC West. There's still going to be an SEC East. But Alabama, for instance, already has, the SEC West opponents, and then they have 2 SEC East opponents already scheduled, and that's Georgia and Tennessee. And so they're now going to add 2 other SEC opponents. They haven't finalized it yet. My understanding is that it's going to be 2 out of Florida, Missouri, and Vanderbilt. And so they're still kind of figuring out exactly what that's going to look like. I think one of the things that you can expect is that there is going to be taken into account, trying to keep things equitable and trying to maintain a fair schedule for everybody. And so, just looking at the way things stand right now, Georgia's the best team in the SEC East based on expectations. And Tennessee is probably the 3rd best team in the SEC East. Florida is probably the 2nd best team. So, I don't know if they would necessarily want Alabama to have to play 1, 2, 3, the top 3 teams, given they're already playing the SEC West. And so you're going to have to find some sort of adjustment there, to find something that's going to be fair for everybody. It's not going to be fair for everybody, but I do think they're going to try to take that into account so that, the teams that already have the harder schedule, maybe they get one of the lesser SEC East opponents. And then kind of vice versa. If you're currently scheduled to only play Missouri, Vanderbilt, you might get Florida, Georgia as your extra 2. It's going to be some changes in that regard.
We've got a good question from Travis. I think a lot of people have. He said, when will schedules be finalized? When will fans be able to just look at that schedule for their team?
I mean, I think you could see it in the next week potentially. I think one of the key things, again, this week, which is like, let's figure out when are we starting and then what is the structure that we're doing. And so talking to people around the SEC last night after the decision, I think they were kind of like, hey, let's just get into the weekend. Let's enjoy the fact that we had these two big decisions made, and then we can kind of finalize those other things. And so it's something that's already been in communication. Again, I think these schools already have a pretty good sense as to who they're likely going to have to face. But I think they're still kind of working out the details. And the SEC in particular has, appointed Mark Womack, who's one of their, I guess he's probably number three, I guess, in the SEC internally, as the guy who's going to kind of be the scheduling guru for these other things. And so he's working through some different models right now. And, the key thing to understand is that this isn't a shock that they went to a 10-game conference only. They've been working under this model for a while. They've talked about these different things. So it's not that they're kind of starting from scratch here, but it's just kind of doing things in due time and making sure it's as fair for people as possible.
We've got a lot of questions about fans, and I think that is something that everybody is concerned about, especially our season ticket holders. What do we know about fans in the stadiums for these games?
Yeah, it's something that's also being discussed right now. You saw, Alabama's AD, Greg Byrne, yesterday essentially saying it's going to be greatly reduced from what you would normally see, which I think is, makes sense. Obviously, as things continue to happen, you're not going to see 100,000 fans in Bryant-Denny. That's just not going to happen. I don't want things change so much, so I want to give myself a little caveat there. But I would say extremely unlikely we see 100,000 fans at Bryant-Denny this season. But talking to people around the league, the general expectation is that there's going to be some sort of uniform policy so that you don't see widely variant, stadiums. You don't want to see one stadium have 50,000 fans and one stadium has no fans. I don't think that's necessarily what makes the most sense. But that said, Texas A&M's AD, Ross Bjork, before I came on here, said that they're still kind of hoping for 50% capacity, which to me feels very high and honestly a bit unlikely. And so it's another thing that they're trying to figure out. I've talked to people around the SEC. It's something that's honestly a stressful situation for all of them. They're trying to figure out, not only how many fans can you have in the stands, but most importantly for them, who are those fans? You have to figure out how many students are you letting in? Which alumni are you letting in? Is it your people who give you the most money? Is it trying to spread it out? I read a story about that in the past. It's a very tricky thing because you don't want to upset all of your kind of wealthy boosters, but you don't want to exclude all the students, and you don't want to just only let the same people in for every game. And so there's a lot of different complications that go with that. And I think that's something that they're all kind of working through right now. And of course, there is a tremendous amount of money attached to having fans in the stands. And so I think in part what you're going to see potentially is a cautious approach because nobody wants to leave money on the table. They're going to want to have as many fans in the stands as safely and possible. And so I don't think these schools want to decide today, all right, we can only have 10% of our fans. And then come September 26th, things are a lot better, and they could have had 50% of their fans, And so I think that's why you're going to see a little bit of patience there, which I know is frustrating for fans because they want to know if they can go to games. But unfortunately, they might have to wait a little bit as every school kind of figures out what makes the most sense for them.
And you talk too about money, and I know that sometimes people hate to hear that, but a lot of times it really does boil down to the money. And like you said, they don't want to leave money on the table that they could have gotten and didn't. And we have to look at these season ticket holders. Who are they going to get refunds if they can't go to the games? Has anything like that been discussed yet?
Yeah, I think most schools know they have to give refunds if they don't offer those tickets to people. I think what you're going to see, and I think some schools have already put this out there, is that they're going to give you an option to either have a refund or basically have it kind of paid forward. So say you already paid, I don't know, $1,000 for your tickets for 2020. They might say, we can give you that refund right now, or we'll just put it toward your 2021 tickets. And so they're going to give you options. Obviously, they prefer if you just roll it ahead because that's money in the bank for them right now. And every athletic department needs some money right now, given the financial ramifications of what we've seen already. I think that they also could potentially give you your donation back. I think that's something that you might have to ask for. But a lot of times, especially for these bigger SEC schools, you don't just get to pay $1,000 for your tickets. You might have to give a $5,000 donation just to have the right to buy those tickets. And so that's another thing that they kind of need to be figured out. But I think that at a minimum, they're not just going to keep your money and give you nothing. I don't think that's something that legally they'd even be able to do.
I think that was a good question brought up by Jimbo. And he said he's been a season ticket holder for 8 years and his dad was one for 42 years. So that's a long time. So Jimbo, I know you, like a lot of people, are obviously very invested in going to these games. So we are waiting to hear a little bit more about how that's going to work. Now we're getting some questions and I'll go ahead and put this one up from Kelly. And so with this shift in the scheduling, what does that do for the Iron Bowl, for the Alabama-Auburn game? Is that going to be moved from its traditional after Thanksgiving weekend?
It's a great question, and it's one that I've gotten a lot as well. I think that, unfortunately, Kelly, there's not a definitive answer at this point. But I think that, there's some different schools of thought about this. I've talked to somebody, talked to somebody in SEC yesterday about this, and you can look at it from a couple different ways. You can either try to backload your divisional games, which are the most important. That's the games that are going to determine, who wins the division, who gets to go to the SEC championship game. And so there's some school of thought that you want to move all those games toward the back of your schedule. And so that would mean, because Alabama and Auburn are in the same division, that you would have that game at the end of your season. There are other people that believe maybe you move those to the front of the season because if they're the most important, you want to try to get them in case things go bad or in case, we have a resurgence or a second surge, and those games get wiped out down the end. You want to make sure you have your Iron Bowl and not potentially lose at the end of the season. And so there's no real consensus around that. I would think that given, it's, I would say, the marquee game of the SEC, that they would want to keep it in kind of that end of season time slot. It's such an important game. It's kind of a natural, nice conclusion, I think, to the regular season. But I think that's something that's still being debated. And again, I think, there's 14 different schools in the SEC. They come from different states. They all have different opinions. What might make most sense for one school is different than another. And so Alabama and Auburn, they might have the same kind of mentality sometimes, but Kentucky and Florida might feel completely differently. And so you kind of deal with all these different voices to try to figure out what makes the most sense. But, I think hopefully we'll have a better sense of that, in the next week or two.
Let's talk about something you mentioned a little bit ago, and that is if, say, the season starts and despite everybody's best efforts, there is an outbreak or there are several very key players or maybe your whole first string or maybe all your quarterbacks all somehow come down with coronavirus. Is there a plan for how to handle these possible team outbreaks, or is that something that each school is going to have to decide?
Yeah, I think you're going to see some standardized protocol around that. One of the things that I've seen that I think Sports Illustrated first reported about was that, they have a plan in place essentially that if you come into, I think the exact wording, close contact or some sort of ambiguous term with somebody who tests positive, that you're going to then have to quarantine for 14 days, even if you then test negative for it. So that's one of those things that, people that I've talked to have issues with because essentially in other leagues, you have to test once, maybe you have to test negative twice, but then they let you back in. Whereas this, even if you test negative 3 times or whatever it is, you still have to work your 14 days. And so that's something that I think is a major hurdle for teams to try to figure out right now because, again, what does that mean? Is it in a meeting room, one person tests positive and everybody in that room is determined to have had close contact and all those people have to get shut down for 2 weeks? If that happens, it's going to shut your team down. And so I think they're still trying to figure out what is the thing that is both safe from a public health standpoint, but also makes the most sense from a football standpoint. And so that's kind of a tricky thing because, they're not always completely aligned. But I think that's something that they're trying to figure out right now. And again, I think you're seeing kind of a broad Power 5, that's ACC, SEC, Big 12, Big 10, Pac-12, try to come up with some general plans amongst themselves, but then you might see some individualized plans, whether within the SEC or ACC or whatnot. But the testing protocols is a massive piece of whether we're going to have football in the fall.
You talk about some of these other conferences. What are some of the other conferences doing? I know the SEC was not the first to announce this conference-only schedule.
Yeah, so essentially everyone's kind of moving this direction. So the Big Ten was the first one to come out and decide to move to a conference-only schedule. The Pac-12 then followed them. The ACC came out on Wednesday, and they had kind of that, as I mentioned, that 10+1 hybrid model of 10 conference games and then 1 non-conference game still on the table. The SEC going with 10 conference games only. The last kind of remaining one out there is the Big 12, which is expected to make an announcement on Monday. The Big 12 has publicly stated they would like to do 12 games if possible, but unfortunately, just kind of the way this works is that they're all kind of tied together. And so if 4 of the 5 are all doing conference only, essentially, the Big 12 almost kind of has to go that direction. Maybe they do 10+1 like the ACC, but those just kind of big games that they were going to play, they're just gone now. So Texas is going to play LSU. That game's gone. Oklahoma was going to play Tennessee. That game's gone. And so they're all kind of tied, even though they make their own individual decisions. And so they all kind of, follow themselves in some ways. It's kind of a little like dominoes in some regard. And so we've got 4 of the 5 down, and the Big 12 is the next one on Monday. But I would expect them to, in some regard, follow what everybody else is doing.
Like you said, it might be a little bit impossible if everybody else is only going to do conference and they want to do some out of conference games. That seems like it could be a little bit of a logistical conflict. Got a question, and this is a kind of comment from Gerald that I think is an important question some people might be thinking, and that is football is a close contact sport. There is no denying that. And there are questions of, are these players going to be wearing masks when they're playing?
I think so you're seeing a couple of different things around that. One, you're seeing development around visors that can be put inside the helmets to possibly be, these used to protect, things that like, not to be gross, but like spit and things like that. That happens in football because you're so close to each other. If there's a pile up on football, people are, spit, and it gets a little gross down there. And so these things would be created to try to prevent some of that transference of droplets and things like that. I think that you're going to see people on the sidelines potentially have to wear masks. You're seeing that, in other sports as something. And so, will we potentially see Nick Saban wearing a mask on the sidelines? It's possible. It might be one of the things that they insist on happening in order to keep people safe. I think they're still working out some of those different things. Football, like I think, you and I were talking about earlier, Ivana, like it's one of the trickiest to figure out. It's the most probably in contact of all the different sports. It's different than baseball. It's different than soccer. And so it's naturally going to create some challenges. And unfortunately, I think it just kind of the risk that's going to be associated with playing football. You're seeing at the NFL level, a bunch of players have already opted out from playing this season because of the risk. You've seen a few players at the college football level opt out because of the risk. I think that they just know naturally, because of the way football is played, there's just going to be some more risks involved than maybe in baseball or something like that, where there's less direct contact amongst players.
Absolutely. And you talk about just getting a pile up in football and all of just any type of body fluid that's being, transmitted down there. My husband played rugby. I understand there's a lot that happens. And the whole point of a game like rugby, like football, is unfortunately to get in close contact. Yep. And that's something that I'm sure the sport in at least the last couple of decades has never dealt with, how to make a close contact sport doable when close contact is extremely discouraged.
Yeah, they've never had to, and I think that's part of the challenge is, I think everybody talks about how it's unprecedented, and it's an overused word at this point, but it really is. Nobody's ever gone through this. Nick Saban's never had to think about how do I coach during a pandemic. None of us ever had to deal with that. And so you're already seeing adjustments. You're seeing, the way that they practice is going to be different. The way that they have people in certain rooms. I've heard that, you mentioned, I think, if all your quarterbacks get sick at the same time, like they're purposely devising different plans to avoid that. So you might have your number 1 string quarterback and maybe your number 3 string or number 4 string quarterback, they're practicing together. And you might have another separate practice where it's your number 2 and 3 so that you don't get wiped out completely. And you would never do that in the past, but I've heard of coaches maybe having to have, maybe 2 or 3 practices in a single day and just breaking up the team in different little parts. It's a lot more work for them, but that might be the only way they can do it safely because, again, I've already heard from different schools, where they said, hey, if we start the season right now, I might have no offensive linemen. Like you can't have that happen during the season. Otherwise, you're going to be in a lot of trouble. And so they're going to do these kind of little different things they've never had to do before just because it's just the way of the world right now.
That's really interesting. I wouldn't have thought about that, about the different practices for different strings, but that completely makes sense. When do you think that we will know a little bit more about how this is going to work practice-wise and even game-wise? When do we expect some more of those announcements?
Yeah, so again, I think you can see the start of practice for fall camp, could be August 7th, which is, I guess, next week at this point. So you might see some different teams start up, and I think you're going to see, just kind of potentially some different looks there. Now, unfortunately, just the way that things work right now, like you're not going to have media most likely at any of these practices. Typically at AL.com, like we have reporters at Alabama and Auburn practices, and they have, they let us in for 10 to 15 minutes from time to time. That's just not going to happen right now, and that's in part to mitigate the risk. They can't control what every reporter has done, and so we're not going to see probably exactly what they're doing in there. Maybe we'll get some photos of different looks, but I think that's when you're going to see the start of things. And then, the key thing, which I haven't even brought up yet, is that, the SEC is planning on starting September 26th, but all the other conferences are, as of right now, planning to start earlier than that. So, the Big 12, some of their schools, and these games might get canceled, but they had scheduled some games August 29th. And so we might see, the SEC could potentially have some, a couple of weeks of figuring out how things work for other schools. They're kind of letting the other conferences in some ways be the guinea pigs to this and see, what they have during their games and the outbreaks and things like that. And they can kind of learn from that. We might eventually see other conferences kind of move back the way that the SEC did. I think the Pac-12 might start a week before the SEC right now. But as of right now, the SEC has moved it back the furthest. And so they have the benefit potentially of a few weeks of other schools having to play games before they have to.
I think that's a good idea. It's a good point. And I think that a lot of people kind of respect that idea of saying, look, we'll let everybody else try it out first and we'll learn from your mistakes and we will do it our way starting later after we see what works for you. John, thank you so much for coming and breaking down this for us. I'm going to end here with a comment from Don. I'm not going to put it on the screen because he gives a War Eagle in there and I don't want my other people with all their Roll Tide comments getting mad. So I'm just going to read it. But John said, I hope we can just have some type of season while keeping everyone safe. And John, I think you wrapped it up right there. I think that is the name of the game here and something that most of us are all on the same page with. So thank you so much, John. I appreciate you breaking it down. And for everybody else, we will see you on Monday. Have a great weekend.